Hi, my name's Kevin Martin. This is Between the Vines, and I have here with me Jennifer Phillips Russo. And he's not with us this week. We wanted to touch base with you on some of our upcoming events and also an upcoming, series as part of the podcast. We want to take this time when it's cold and things aren't growing to take some time out of our where we really discuss what's happening and current events in the vineyards and give you some practical information about soil tests and nutrition. So obviously we're going to lean on Jennifer quite a bit with that, and that's why she's here with us today. But before we get to that, I do want to again remind everybody and discuss some of our upcoming events. Jennifer, good afternoon. We're a little late this morning. We usually shoot, or a little late this afternoon. We usually shoot this in the morning, but
I was collecting bugs.
so you were out in the cold.
I was out in the cold, which is why if you're watching this video blog, I look the way I do today.
Oh, just listen to the audio.
So we do have some upcoming events. Very most important to us is our winter conference series. Really excited about what we have to offer you guys. We decided to do 2 virtual events, one in January and one in February. And our first one is coming up, and I believe it's next week. It's January 19th. If you happen to miss we have 2 speakers. We have Mr. Kevin Martin, who is not to be forgotten. He will be talking about bins, a case study with bins and bulk, and what he has seen. He is normally I almost said hypotheticalized. That's what the cold.
Close enough.
That's what the cold did to my head out there. What it would be like if a smaller grower implemented. So he has had people actually do it, and he's going to report on that. So we're looking forward to hearing that. Please don't miss it if you've been thinking about the possibility of switching. And the other half of the conference is going to be almost a repeat with Dr. Terry Bates and Nick Gunner from Orbitist on the MyEV tool. If you had any questions about how you could use it, why would you use it, what it has to offer, there's going to be a talk about that and walking you through a setup. So please come prepared with your cell phone in hand if you're going to watch that one. The second one is in February, and that's February 16th. That particular conference, my brain it's our spray program. We applied for credits for this. If you were part of our spray program that was led by our own Andy Musa and Brian Head of PSU, last spring, we're going to repeat that again this spring. It's a way to get credits, hopefully. I mean, it was already pre-approved course. I had submitted it to New York State DEC, and Andy has submitted it to Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. So hopefully we'll hear back that they have been approved. But most likely they usually approve courses that have already been pre-approved, and these have. So hopefully, fingers crossed, good energy out there that we can get credits for it. Just a spot to come see us in the wintertime and set up your spray programs for next year. Do you have anything to add about that? I feel like I always kind of gloss. Are you going to be adding? They always ask you for prices and stuff.
Am I going to be what?
Adding to that conference, that virtual one in February?
I think so. I'm not sure. We'll see how things play out. I know Andy.
He always asks, so.
Well, I know that they can certainly fill that time slot. But we'll see what kind of pricing data we get, because right now that data is pretty bad. And I don't want to provide bad data. So we'll see how that goes, and we'll certainly touch on why that data is bad and what that means for the industry. The other thing is just keep in mind that this conference is a series, so it's going to be a little bit more expensive than it was in the past. If you can recall a long way back to our last winter conference, the price of grapes is up, the price of beef is up, the price of getting events catered is also up. So the price of everything is up, and we don't have much of a choice but to pass that on to you. But in exchange for that, we've changed around the structure of how we charge for things to try to maximize your value. And as part of that, not only will there be a lower cost for additional attendees, there will also be these other series that Jen was talking about. So I only bring that up again because Jen already did say it, but just from a logistical standpoint, please register as soon as you can so you don't miss out on next week on Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. And also, you only have to register, I believe. You certainly only have to pay once. Jen, do you only have to register once?
I think you have to register. You have to register once, but if you're looking for DEC credits, there's going to be another step. Well, you'll have to provide.
Right. Yeah. So the DEC step that she's referring to is we need to collect some additional data to make sure you get credits that we don't collect when you register and pay for the conference series.
Right.
But there will only be one actual registration for all 3 events, and then we'll collect some more data for your credits.
We should also, I'm sorry. Yeah, we should also mention that you can't do a la carte either. So it's a flat rate fee. You get all 3, whether you want to attend 1, none, 2. It's a flat rate fee. I know somebody's going to ask that question.
But you could do a la carte for the credits. So if you attend part 2, the spray session 1, you will get credits just for attending that. So there won't be like a hold on those credits until the end of the series. That's related to the meeting. But in terms of the registration and the fees, it's just the one step.
Right.
I think that's all I have to add. That's all I really had to add. We are also
all of our speakers locked in for the in-person one. I'm excited for that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We are also planning a summer conference. Very preliminary right now. Just wanted to tease it, and we'll give you some more information as we start to get speakers and events and dates lined up. But that is in the works. We're excited to be back doing some of those things. So we are certainly planning on doing that this summer. Either in, we're going to try to hit where our region and our industry isn't quite as busy. So sort of the end of July or early August, we'll let you know when we know more. I think that's all we have, and we can probably jump into sort of this first session on nutrition. And we're not really going to talk about nutrition. We're just going to talk about how to take a scoop of dirt and mail it. And we're going to do a whole podcast on taking a scoop of dirt and how you mail that.
It's funny that you say take a scoop of dirt, because when we talk about soil and soil health, if you have a scoop of dirt, you just have like the mineralized rock and crumbled up, weathered rock. But to have soil health, you need to have biology in there.
I am, making this as simple as I can as a sort of an ironic statement. We had a long discussion about before this podcast about, how one takes a soil sample and what that looks like. So there's a reason we're talking about this, because, I think not even all the researchers can completely agree. But certainly we have come to, some conclusions for our industry in terms of what some of the best practices are, and where we could go as an industry to maybe improve what we're doing and that kind of a thing.
Right. Which is sort of a jumping off zone for what I want to do going forward in these winter months. Kevin alluded to it in the beginning, where we want to kind of break down soil tests and talk about each of the nutrients and how the plant uses it, why the plant uses it, how is it obtained from the soil, just to kind of give you an idea of why it's important, why soil health tests are important to your vineyard production and the vine growth. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm excited. I'm not going to give a lot of information on this one because I want each one to have its own type of topic. But just to go back about pH, even is one of the most important things. I'll give you that. Your plant growth. And there have been studies on this, which we will touch base in future podcasts on. I will credit the appropriate researchers. The best range for your pH to be in is 5.5 to 6.5. And we tend to have very acidic soils in Western New York, not in like the Niagara Escarpment. A lot of them tend to be a little bit more basic. Maybe that's where we start. Do you know what acidic is, and do you know what basic is? If you have suggestions or have questions that you've always wanted to know about, please email myself or Kevin at do we always flash our email? I am jjr268@cornell.edu. Or you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say you can, as long as it's a soil test question, I think your email will work just fine.
Do it for me. Kevin, you should see his eyes. So I would love to hear what have you always wondered about on soil tests, and send that in. Otherwise, you're just going to hear what I think you should know about soil health tests and where it should go. And I don't want to fill it with jargon and what you need to know. If you have certain questions that have always been on your mind, please send them in. We'll help demystify it.
So 2 questions I think I have that are a little related to what we're going to cover today, which we didn't have a lot of grower input on, partially because I don't think we asked too much. So you get to hear what we want to talk about for now, and we can change that in the future. But both on a time scale and also just on a density scale, how many soil samples should a grower take? Yeah.
You're talking to somebody who has soil health on the brain and really wants to know what's out there and how they're performing. But if you talk about the industry, and everybody else listening, you probably don't do that many soil tests per year. And if you are using our lab and going through the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program, I know there's only a handful of you doing that. So there are 331 members, and I think I may see 4 or 5 a year come through. Not stating that you don't go elsewhere. I mean, there are other areas that you can definitely send your soil to, and you can get sort of the same results. Just something else that I would really like to look at. But in general, I would say most people take 5 samples, and that's over their entire acreage. That's kind of what we're trying to move away from. I'm glad you're taking soil samples. Thank you for doing that. But you know that there's variation in your vineyards just by knowing your vines driving up and down, knowing how they produce. So I would prefer that you go to what we call a grid sample. But I can let you know Kevin and I were talking about this, and there is kind of 3 ways that people do it right now. One is they just go out and grab a sample here and there. The other is that they have used sort of the MyEV that we've been working on over the last 6-7 years, where we kind of direct your samples a little bit more to capture more of that variation. And the third is where they are taking 1 sample per acre or whatever grid sampling that you set up, so that they can capture more of that variation and just go back and do those same sampling spots for a couple of years, not every year in a row. For instance, I have a grower with almost 200 acres who does half of their farm every year and the other half the year after that. So you could alternate it. Your soil health isn't going to change that much from one season to the next. But I completely lost my train of thought on that one. So you can break it up. But if you do a grid sampling, you will be able to capture more of that variation, especially if you're looking to make your amendments a little, so you're not blanketing everything in your vineyard in regards to nitrogen. Well, I don't know if you would variable rate nitrogen that much, but potash or lime, you're not liming where you don't need to, so on and so forth. That answer your question?
Yes, sort of. So one thing you did bring up is that you don't necessarily have to. So if you did grid sampling and you have a grid, and let's say you're doing, I don't know, 3-acre grids, so you have 1 sample per 3 acres. I know that others go smaller than that, and certainly historically much larger than that, but we'll just use that number for the sake of, I don't know what I'm talking about, so I'm letting you correct me if that number's wrong. But you don't have to take that individual sample every single year.
Right.
But what I would sort of bring to the attention of the growers when they look at their recommends is that recommends traditionally are often written in the context of a single year. Meaning, if you have a pH of 3, which I've never seen before, but I've seen 4 too.
I've seen 4 too.
Recommend in an individual year is only going to be, well, depending on what that buffer pH is, but it's only going to be 2 ton of lime. So most recommends are never going to recommend more than that. You could have a much higher pH with a fairly high buffer pH of, say, give me 1 second.
So you're throwing things out there that we're assuming everybody knows what you're talking about.
Right. So we'll get, if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, you're going to have to tune in next week.
Right.
But basically what I'm saying is, if you had a fairly high buffer pH of say 6.5, um, or 6.2, I'm sorry, of 6.2, you might need 2 ton of lime. So the recommend would look the same. But obviously there's some context there in that what that recommend sometimes is missing is what you should do in the following year. And what I've seen a historical pattern of that I had no idea really existed.
Oh, sorry. The joys of working remote.
What I've seen is that if you do a soil sample every 3 or 5 years, you put on that ton or 2 ton of lime when you do your soil samples, and then you skip 3 to 5 years, which in the right context does make sense because lime is not necessarily a general maintenance activity. Once you get it right, it might stay that way for a couple of years, and you can certainly do too much. It's not a nutrient that you pull out of the soil, but there are, and this is not limited to lime, but in all of these recommends, they're limited to 1 year of the recommend. So you have to get some context as to what you should do in those years where you're not sampling, even though you don't have to sample every year. That's all I'm saying.
That's
and hopefully the dog stopped barking.
I know.
Jennifer
I unmuted. You know it's going to happen again. Yes, that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. So we will be talking about pH and buffer pH next week. So if that was a little bit confusing and you always wondered the difference between the two, we'll let you know what that is. Until you guys send us in some information. We should also talk about, wow, there's so much. I'm so glad we decided to do this. What a limiting factor is. Does everybody know what a limiting factor is? I'll touch on that next week. Look at me writing my notes down for those of you.
I hope that's another teaser because I don't think we need to get into that. So yeah, I think one of the trends in the agricultural industry and potentially maybe in grapes or even in Concord grapes is towards more of a grid sampling.
It's what we do in research.
Yep. So you're encouraging it. We're starting to see a little bit of it, but full disclosure, we're not seeing a lot of it yet. From my perspective, it makes a lot of sense because we're seeing rising fertilizer prices. And also we're starting to see, I guess there's always been the caveat, like fertilizer is expensive. So now they're going to do more sampling. But when fertilizer was inexpensive, you can do too much and it can have harmful effects. And I think we did see a little bit of that.
Did you just come over to my side, Kevin?
No, I don't care about the lady. I'm talking about the vineyard.
I'm always trying to limit the amount that we actually put in because of leaching reasons and what it can do to the environment around. And Kevin and I go round and round about that.
Yeah, no. We are actually going to talk along those lines. We're going to talk about phosphorus because Jen said before this podcast that most of the samples she sees don't see, a need for potassium recommendations. But
phosphorus.
I'm sorry, phosphorus. She doesn't, she sees a lot of samples where there's not a need for phosphorus. And, I think that's true for the most part. Like I'm just looking at somebody's soil samples and they did almost 100 samples and they've got 50 that don't need any phosphorus. But they also have another 30 that need a little bit and 10 or 15 that need quite a bit. So, I think especially with macronutrients, we don't want to ignore any of them. And I'm not necessarily saying it's a good time to over apply phosphorus given the price of phosphorus, but we should still apply what we need. And so we're going to have to talk about that one as well.
For the surrounding environment.
What it takes.
That is our plan moving forward. It's a good thing you mentioned.
So one of the things that came up, I'm sorry, you go ahead.
You had mentioned something just a couple of minutes ago, and it's always been on my mind, and I'm glad that we're hashing it out and everybody can listen to us about this. I had asked a grower just yesterday, what is your budget for soil sampling? Like what would you think is an okay amount of your budget to apply to figure out what your soil is so that you can get your amendments correct and help your vines? And this particular grower had a pretty healthy budget, but I don't know. I've not heard that from many other people. what is a normal budget for soil sampling? What should you be budgeting? If you have 100 acres, or let's go 50 acres. If you have 50 acres, what's a good budget for soil sample? Because I want at least 50 samples. I want you sampling on a 1 acre grid.
Um, I don't necessarily think it's healthy to budget that way at all, I
Why?
guess, because really your budget can be dictated by, um, I guess the way I look at it is you're making investments in your vineyard, regardless of what those investments cost. So, if your vineyard needs potassium, for example, and the price of potassium doubles, it doesn't make sense to reduce your potassium by 50%. Like, it doesn't make sense to stick to that budget. Like, this is America. In rural America, we all need a car. If the price of cars goes up, we don't drive less cars.
Right.
I guess if you have a fleet of 7, maybe you can reduce to 6, but I'm still going to have one car. There's things you tweak. You might drive it a year longer. You might use a little bit less potash. You might try to make your applications more efficient. The same thing with sampling. Sampling is very inexpensive relative to the cost of fertilizer, even when fertilizer is cheap. It doesn't really make sense to me to budget it. It makes sense to me to take the number of samples I need and tweak things if I'm concerned about costs. Like, do I really need boron on all 200 of the samples I'm taking this year?
Right.
Um, but I'm not really concerned whether I'm spending 750 or $1,200 on soil samples when I'm going to go out and spend 20 or 30 or $40,000 on fertilizer to get a crop that's worth, four or $500,000. It makes sense to track your expenditures and see where they're going to see if your business is healthy, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to stop investing in your business because something got expensive.
So you are in support of taking more soil samples, possibly
I
moving.
guess it depends on who you are. A lot of times we spend a lot of our effort and energy helping out growers that take lots and lots of soil samples. So I don't necessarily think they all need to take more. I think some of them could even take less. But I think you're talking about, a vocal minority in that group. Um, I think for the most part, when you take too few samples, you don't necessarily learn enough about what's actually going on.
Right. And that's what I would like to see happen.
I
Is it?
think I think the more I learn about it, the more I get concerned about local variation. So you might say this level, this nutrient looks great, and maybe it just looks great in that one little tiny spot. And if it were me, I'd want to take more samples to learn more about whether or not I'm getting something close to an actual reading, or if I just got unlucky or lucky when I took that one sample to try to represent 50 acres.
That's a good
Um,
point you just brought up about that one little spot. So I recommend doing a composite sample for your one sample. So in that area that you're looking to sample, whether it be the length of a panel, make sure that you take sort of a W pattern. You want to take what we call a 6-inch cookie, like 6-inch by 1-inch cookie or a slice of earth. You need to scrape off the top layer that has any of, your cover crop or your green middle row, anything that can throw off of some of the nutrients that would be in there, scrape that off. And that's what you're going to throw into a bucket from that, like take a W, the point of the W, the bottom of the W, the middle of the W, put them all in one bucket, mix them up. And then that becomes your one sample to kind of grab some of that variation in the middle. Don't just take it from one spot, not just one cookie. There are
yeah.
videos out there too.
Yeah, the one thing I might say about a W is I like a W because I like broadcasting fertilizer. Um, I wonder if a W makes the most sense for people that band
Well,
because it sounds like I'm just imagining the shape of a W. You might
uh-huh.
have to sort of modify the shape of the W so that you're slightly biased toward the under row because you're going to have deficiencies in the row middle. You're essentially not trying to grow roots there.
Right.
Um,
So then make that W to where you know that you're applying your fertilizer.
or keep it separate if you're trying to learn more about the row middles for some reason, but to try to average them together in a way that's biased towards middles might concern me. Just a thought. I would avoid the issue altogether and just broadcast everything. That's what I would do. um it's very difficult to broadcast certain nutrients. So I think once you start to have these nutrients that have relationships with each other and you're broadcasting one and banning the other, I'm not going to mess around with it. Not for the sake of this potential small amount of efficiency that you gain, that I think you could even argue about that. Especially over a longer time scale. But that does get back to my point in terms of sort of local variation. One of the things in grid sampling that I think might get overlooked, and I don't know if it's important or not, so I'm just going to ask you your opinion on it. So you've got this 1 acre or 3 acre square. Do you go in and you take your W wherever you want? Or do you look for the best find? Do you look for the worst find? Or you just always go back to the same spot?
So that's a good question. And it really depends on what you're looking for in your vineyard. I would highly suggest that you try to capture the variation. You know where your vines are heavier, you know where your vines are weaker. And if you've never done a soil sample before, which I know is just a very few of you out there, that you want to be able to capture why. Is it in the soil that's causing this vine to be weaker than that vine over there? So I want you to take a composite sample in the area where there are weaker vines, composite sample, and then go back, like we just said, to that area. It doesn't have to be the exact spot that you dug the cookie from before, but that general area so that you can see how the soil is changing, if it's changing at all, with what your management practices are. Does that solve what you were just saying? Because there are people walking in my house that I know the dog is going to bark, so I can't.
Yeah, I think so. So what you're saying is within that 1 acre or 3 acre square,
At least 3.
you would walk around, and each year or every 3 years when you were there, you would take a sample from a different location.
No. Well, if you were only going to take one sample, yes.
Well, I think
go ahead.
On a grid that small, you probably would only take one, right? You're not taking multiple samples within an acre.
Oh, yeah. No, you're right. In the grid that small, I would go back to that same particular area where you had gotten your first sample so that you can see change over time. I wouldn't take it from the upper corner of that and the lower corner the next year. You want to see change over time to see what's going on.
Yeah, and I think you'll already find that it's going to be confounding enough to frustrate you without introducing more variability. So you'll do something like apply 1 ton of lime, and your pH will go down because you changed locations, and you'll be frustrated by that.
Right.
And hopefully, that will still occur, I think, but it will occur much less frequently and dramatically, and you'll actually see some progress. And I think the point of that is some of these measurements are somewhat relative. Yes, within the little bit of soil that you sent to the lab, they're fairly reliable, but as it reflects everything that's going on in that whole 45,000 or 150,000 square feet, they're, yes and no. Like, it'll be close enough so that we get some healthy vines and produce a good crop, but it's not going to be close enough to the decimal point on your sample.
Well, I think that's a big enough teaser. I do have another webinar that I'm supposed to get to.
Well, thank you for joining us and teasing that, and we will work this out. I don't think we will necessarily do a nutrient topic every single week. Right. But probably we're going to average every other week, depending on what we can fit in. And by the time we start to see bud swell, we should be done with this. And we'll go back and do it again next year with more in line of what we learn about research updates and things like that. But you will have these sort of as a reference to take a look at your own soil and petiole samples and their results, and be able to not only just follow recommends, but also help yourself interpret them. So when you're trying to do things like, what should I do next year since I'm not going to take a sample? You'll have the information to be able to figure that out because you'll understand the context. So that's the goal here. And also in the meantime, join us for our conference series and other events we have coming up. Thank you for joining us this week, and we'll be back next week. Thanks a lot.
Take care, everyone.